All right, Matthew, welcome to episode 74, a three-part series of the Performance Advantage podcast, where we bring sports science to the people with myself, Dr. Will O'Connor, PhD sports scientist and ultra athlete, as well as a coach and endurance sports science educator, with my co-host, Dr. Matt Miller, who is the inventor of Brakeace, hardware and software for analyzing your brake power. He is also a lad.
Thanks for the introduction, Will. It's good to streamline it. Yeah.
So we have a three-part series around biking power meters, cycling, mountain biking, power. It is the hot topic in the cycling bike two-wheel world, and there's a lot to cover. So we'll split this one up into three parts. We've got, the introduction, picking a power meter, making sure you get the right one, which ones are the best, Matt's research study, which has been cited, numerous times around what power meters to get. Then it's about getting started. And then we've also got the third and final one around training with power. So we're setting you up pretty well here over these next three parts.
Yeah, well, this follows on real nicely from the fundamentals of training with mountain bike power meter course that we're just finishing up. Launches soon, so by the time all these three episodes are out, that course is going to be ready. We already have people signed up waiting to get on that course, and that was actually really fun. So we figured what we'd do is we'd go back and redo the podcast that we did. I think it was like episode 3 on training with a power meter. It was so long ago, and we've come a long way since then with the things that we know and the value that we're able to provide to our listeners. Our listener base has really grown. So we wanted to go back and do that again and kind of really get into the nitty gritty for you.
All right, Matthew, so we are back for part 3 of the 3-part episode 74 training or cycling power meter series. So we've just finished setting your zones if you're rolling straight on from part 2, and in part 1 we had buying your power meter. What is power? Getting yourself pretty on the level with the fundamentals. We've done our test, we've got it all set up. Now Matt, I'm wanting to go rip the cranks off. How am I going to make myself a better athlete now I've got this $1,000 device slapped on my $10,000 bike?
Yeah. Well, so we're not going to be able to get into it crazy deep. So this is going to be like a bit of a teaser, if you will, for our fundamentals of using a power meter course on the performanceadvantagepodcast.com. So you can check that out where we get really into depth into what to do. And then also check out our sports science masterclass where we talk about what's actually happening inside the body and the sports science of actually going out there and exercising.
Yeah, and of those 6 modules, one of them is fully dedicated to writing your own training plan or helping you write a training plan for the athletes that you work with. Okay. With that said, let's go.
Okay. So we talked briefly about in the last episode about setting our zones. And I said I like to use Andy Coggin's 6 zones. So I just put it into Training Peaks. I don't even remember what the actual percentage splits are for setting your training zones. I honestly don't remember. So I just put in FTP in Training Peaks, click calculate zones, and then apply. And then it's kind of done for me. So the beautiful thing about setting zones is now me and the athlete and me and other coaches have a common language that we're talking about.
And same with, you and other coach, training plans.
Yep.
Right. You know how to understand what is being said to you.
Yeah. So if I were to say ride at 300 watts to Will, that would mean a lot more than if someone told me to ride at 300 watts. And that's because we have different mass, we have different threshold power. So if we say ride in zone 2, Will and I are going to go ride at zone 2 and I'm going to totally smoke him. Right? Or something like that. Right. So zone 2 is going to be, that's for me, zone 1 and 2 is like an aerobic session. That's where we spend the most of our time training, riding pretty easy, which is really difficult for our mountain bikers to do because it's tough to ride easy on trails all the time. But now we have our zones And now we can really get rolling with our training plan, because that's how I'm going to communicate to my athletes how to train.
Yeah. And just so quickly, generally they're around like, so zone 1 being essentially 0 through to around 70, 75%. Depends on who you're looking at. And then again, you're going 70. Zone 2, you're going 70% up to around 85%. Zone 3, gray zone, no man's land. You're going
Tempo.
like tempo, 85 to 100%. Then zone 4, you're going to like that 100 to 120%, that VO2 max, that aerobic intensive 5-minute kind of time zone interval based. And beyond that, you're going zone 5. People are going to split this into zone 5A, B, C. They're going to go 5, 6, 7. But now we're starting to look at, 120 plus. So beyond that, it's what it is. And we've got a whole episode on it.
Yeah. We also have some differences too, like you and I. So, and we covered that before, but that's kind of broadly how it is. But the really important thing to know with these zones, and I really want to stress this, is just because you are like 1% into zone 3 doesn't mean that you kind of botched the training session if it was prescribed in zone 2 kind of thing. Because when we're setting training zones, it's kind of to give an idea of what's happening in the muscle. And we're not actually measuring what's happening in the muscle. We're measuring what you did in a performance test a few weeks ago, and then we set a percentage of what you should do based on that. So there's energy systems don't work as like these different levels that are isolated from each other. It's kind of like a dimmer switch where you kind of flow in and out of the others. And training is all about stressing different energy systems. So, take it as you will, but the zones aren't crazy, crazy strict. So we talked about that quite a lot in the training zones episode.
Yeah. And if we're stressing points, Matt.
Yes, please.
Mine is that it's a zone. And zones have lower limits and upper limits.
Yeah.
So and then they've got everything in between the upper limit and the lower limit.
Yeah.
And that is all okay.
Yes, it is. And, training at the lower end of a zone is totally fine because it's a zone. All right. So, check out the other episode because we really get into that one.
All right. So we've got it. Yeah, we've set our zones, and we've got 5 of them. We know what they are. So what should we? How am I going to train?
Well, so now that we have a common language between the coach and the athlete, or usually with the coach and the athlete, now we can head out there and nail a session, right? Yep. So if my prescription was 2x20 zone 4, which is usually what I'm using for threshold, I can look to see how an athlete performs in those 2 separate 20-minute efforts. So these will probably be done up a hill on Zwift or something like that. And what I can do is I can look at how they are able to maintain their power throughout that effort, if they're going too hard at the start, if they're fading at the end. And I can also look at how their heart rate changes within those 2 efforts. Right. So then what I'm start to look at is, okay, how quickly does the heart rate go up? How much does it drift throughout that effort? And how quickly does it come down? Because all those things are going to give me an indication of how this athlete is able to perform at this level. Okay, so what we see a lot of the times is, you say go out and do 2x20 in zone 4, something like we would do like 95% of threshold. What we usually see is that someone goes out and starts with a massive sprint and then tries to hold on for that 20 minutes. So power usually drops off a lot as we go through. So you might start in zone 5, finish somewhere in zone 3 with your power totally exhausted. And you have to do it again. But when we have our power meter, we can train and produce a real steady effort throughout those intervals. And that's when we're nailing a session, training the specific energy system.
Right. Yeah. So now we're really being able to target throughout a whole interval based set, or long hill climb, right on the whatever percentage of that limit. So we know we all know if we say sprint, you can't do that forever because some things are just limited in in the
I don't know,
human body.
Will. You say that, but I think of Matt as a young gung-ho athlete, like trying to make it as a pro. And you tell me to do 2x20s, I'm starting with sprint, right? Because I have a heart rate monitor. That's all that existed then. I'm watching it on my wristwatch, because that's all we had then. And I needed to get my heart rate into working zone. I'm starting with sprint, right? I didn't get it. Even when I had my power meter, I didn't get it, right? I would still start with a sprint because I'm still tracking my heart rate, right? So, but now that we know these zones and we're able to set training based on these zones, you tell me to go out in zone 4, I'm not getting into zone 5, right? Because I know now, because I've done some zone 5 efforts, I know that, if I do 5 minutes in zone 5, I'm going to be pretty tired. So if I start a 20-minute effort at that level, I'm not going to be able to maintain it. It's just not possible.
Right. So if I had to ask you, like, general training plan, right? I've got my zones. I can ride 3 to 4 times a week. And this is just general, like non kind of season specific or anything. Like, could you give me some time in zones, or like how should I structure that just quickly, so we've got a reference point.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things that we like to reference is this 80-20 idea, where you're spending 80% of your rides are in zone 2 or below. So most people, when they go out to train, aren't really doing that. We're spending quite a lot of time in this zone 3, with this gray zone, where it feels like kind of hard, not too hard, and we can maintain it for a real long time. And that actually does a lot of damage to like our muscle cells, because we're generating a bit of acidity, some lactate that we need to buffer. It's not necessarily purely aerobic. So that's the biggest danger, really, is to getting too far into this gray zone, this zone 3. So really, for most athletes, we're spending a lot of our time training really, really easy to develop ourselves aerobically. Does that kind of answer your question? I think it's going to be really athlete dependent, really.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the problem. Like, so some athletes, if you can train 4 days a week, you might be able to hit 2 days pretty hard, but we still need to get that aerobic development. So it depends who we're talking about. When we talked about Steve, our athlete Steve, when we built a training plan for him, so that one's on YouTube, and he only had 4 days a week to train, but he always had one day where he was going out with the boys and he was thrashing himself. So we had to really, watch what he was doing the rest of the time, because we know he was going to be real tired from that ride. So it really depends on the person.
Yeah. Yeah. But I guess what I'm taking from you is that looking at my training, I'm going to make sure that if one ride, generally like your long ride, right? Your weekend long ride is going to be a zone 2 long ride. Like we're going to take specifics out of it, building for an Ironman or like some Paris-Roubaix specialist, classic specialist. That's the bread and butter. So I'm going to make sure I'm not doing this half-ass thing up the hill where I'm in like zone 3, 4, 3 back to 2, 0. Like I'm just trying to keep it super constant so that I'm not overstressing myself in a non-specific way.
Yeah, and it's really difficult if you have to go out and do like a long zone 2 ride when you get to the hills. What the heck do you do? Are you going to tip over? You're going so slow? Or are you going to actually stay in your zone 2 and do an aerobic ride? Right. So a lot of people really struggle with that at first. They end up going into zone 3 on these easy rides on the hills, just because, that's what the group's doing, or they want to go faster up the hills because Strava's running in the background or whatever. But yeah, it really does get tricky. But if you have your set training plan, like your coach doesn't want you to get slower, right? It's in their best interest to help you get faster. So there's a reason there's that zone 2 stuff in there. So, stick with it, and then, try and follow those zones with every workout. So if there's a workout in zone 3, going into zone 4 isn't going to benefit you, right? Because the workouts that follow on from that build from your workout that was in zone 3. So, if there's a zone 5 ride, there's no point really in riding in zone 3 just because, you had a bad day at work. Right? There might be times like that, but, that's the time to push yourself. So yeah, I guess any training plan really takes all kinds of training zones.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you for your very specific, non-ambiguous answer.
We have to do that, though, right?
I know. It's too hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then pacing, right? The race analysis would be next.
Yeah.
The training is, we've got a lot of podcasts and like resources, especially on mtbphd.com. Got the courses, like you can learn. We've got training plans. We've got like a lot of stuff. We've got our personal services. If you want to get a training plan, right, and specifics. Now, you're going to want to analyze your races, right, or at least be prepared to know what you are going to be able to withstand or hold power-wise, performance-wise for a certain distance and duration. So I guess that would be the next step. Like that was if we're still looking at me going into my Ironman, you set me up with everything. I did all the tests. I set all my zones. I was writing my own training, and with help from you and Professor Steve Stannard. But then I was still like, what can I do in the race? Right. And I was doing, some racing as well on Zwift and out on the road and some time trials. So like, yeah, how did you set me up with that kind of stuff?
Well, we had to figure out how long you were going to be on the bike and what you had to do after. So you were in a really specific or a really unique position because you had a really high threshold. So you could hold, you're highly aerobically trained, right? But then you had to go and maintain a set percentage of that. And we didn't know what it was after a swim and before a run.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a bit tricky. And you can't just go out and be like, hey, I'm going to hold 85% of my FTP just because that's what everyone else does on the forums. Right. You need to actually figure out if you can do it.
Yeah.
Right. So you had to go out and try it, really. So, you get your FTP, you go out and see like what can you actually maintain for that time. So if you have a set and say you have a time trial up a hill, you have a hill climb, right? As a part of an event coming up, you want to figure out what power you should hold because you want to do really well in this race. You would have to do the same thing. You'd have to go try it and see what you can actually do. Not start off with a massive sprint, right? So you didn't start off with a massive sprint on the bike in an Ironman because there'd be no point. You have all this time to make up time. And same thing with a hill sprint. Like this is the biggest problem with most people is they start off way too hard in any kind of cycling event, just way too hard. And, we're kind of made to think that racing needs to be hard all the time throughout, but we can't all maintain our FTP forever or 85% for a really long time after a sprint. So I think it really does take a lot of practice to be able to figure out what you can actually do. So I would go out and do an event like you normally do and then analyze the data later and not really look at anything during that event. So for you, that was a practice. Like, what can I maintain for 5 hours? And like, okay, yes. Well, actually we need to adjust this because of this and this. So for most athletes, it's going to be, hey, go do a crit, right? And race it like you normally would. See how you feel when you go for the breakaway on lap 2, right? And then we'll analyze your power. Okay, now next time, see what happens, how you feel when you go for a breakaway on lap 10, right? And how do you feel throughout the rest of the event and how does the race go? For mountain bikers, it's going to be, see what happens if you just start a little bit easier, how you can maintain your power throughout laps. So it's going to be different for every athlete, but it's really important to first go out and get a few performances under our belt and then be able to pick them apart later and then to adjust our strategy accordingly.
Right. I remember learning more about distribution of effort, right? And so this brings up normalized power, which is kind of is one of these metrics that is thrown around online, right? In these forums around, it's more applicable. It's what you should look at. Whatever you want to subscribe to around normalized power. If we just go to distribution of effort, like you're saying with my Ironman, I went out and I did a couple like 5-hour time trials essentially. And when I looked at it, because my course was going to be hilly, I was like, oh wow, there's times at which, I shouldn't just be at whatever, like 85%, because I have like a 4-minute descent afterwards. So I could afford to go a bit harder at points in time, not like way harder, but it was okay to push a little harder to maintain, because in the end, it is your time across a distance, which is going to be your average speed. And the person to take the least amount of time over the set distance is going to be the winner. And so speed is still important. And so maintaining a high average speed is the main goal for the least amount of power. But I just remember looking and being like, wow, the distribution of power is like quite a bit different than sitting on like your indoor trainer.
Yeah, it's not like a Zwift time trial.
No,
outside, is it?
And then just doing these harder efforts and things, trying to do a breakaway at the local club race. Like, oh, I see how I did a new peak 2-minute power off the front within the first 30% of the race, or at halfway or something. And I, like, why wasn't I there in the sprint at the end? No, that's probably a really good answer. Whereas if you'd looked at my heart rate, I was, it's a 1-hour race. I was like fanging it the whole time at 180, 190. And just because I accelerated even harder and got an extra maybe 2 beats on my heart rate, and then recovered, quote unquote recovered, or at least came back to the bunch, because, I'm not that strong and I got caught.
Because you got tired, right? Well,
right. And then, so my heart rate's still elevated. And if we're just looking at that, or we're just looking at speed, we have no input. We have no like real picture about what's happening. But I could look and go, well, no wonder.
Well, yeah. So I think if we look at that race, though, you might leave that race just thinking you're a really bad sprinter, right? Yeah. When in actual fact, what happened is you put in this massive effort in the middle and you'd never recovered, right? Yep. Because you produced your best ever 2-minute power, which in the middle of a race, to not make a break stick, and then to be able to, keep riding at 350 watts or whatever. It's just, of course, you're going to have a bad sprint. You're just smoked. So you need to be able to kind of pick apart where you produce these peak powers and relative to yourself, to see what actually your weakness is. So maybe actually you're an amazing sprinter. You just shouldn't produce your best ever 2-minute power 10 minutes before you have to sprint, right? Because you're really anaerobically trained, So what we often see is athletes producing their highest ever power. So the classic example, I took one of my athletes to the Continental Championships and had a bad race. Like, well, why was your race so bad? I thought actually, it looked pretty good. Like, I just felt so dead the whole time. So we went back and we looked at his file, and best ever 1-minute power at the start of the race, right? So if you think about how you feel when you produce your best ever 1-minute power, how do you feel after that?
Yes.
Tell me how you feel.
Quite stuffed.
You feel absolutely dead because you did your best ever effort for 1 minute. Now, imagine if you had to keep going as hard as possible for 89 more minutes, right? How hard that would feel. So what's the point in doing your best 1-minute effort in a 90-minute race? You're just going to feel really, really tired from doing that best ever 1-minute power. So distributing your energy, because we're humans, we have a limited amount of energy. We have unlimited energy, but we have a limited ability to apply that energy. right? So we need to distribute the pace properly. So starting off with our best ever 1 minute power is not a good way to do it.
Right. So then I'm, especially in my road race, I'm looking at normalized power because it's way higher.
Okay.
Makes me feel better.
So normalized power is if you pedaled real steady, that would, you could sit at 300 watts forever, right? For example, and your average would be 300 watts.
Yeah. So when you're locked in on Zwift or your indoor trainer or that dead flat time trial and you just rock solid.
Yeah.
No variation pretty much.
But then with your time trial that you had where you could go above that 300 watts on the uphills because you were coasting on the downhills, right? You have this time to be able to recover. So what normalized power does is it looks at this section, usually over 15 minutes, and it kind of takes into account the peaks and the valleys of your power output. It says this is actually the average energy demand metabolically of what you did because you went a little bit harder here and you went a little bit easier there. So this is the actual kind of demand of what you just did.
Yeah, and it applies like a greater weighting to the higher number, right? So if we use that 300 watts or my threshold as a reference, now if I'm below my threshold, great, good work, Will. If I go above it, okay, depends, let's say just above, who cares? Way above, mine's 300.
Bad Will.
Yep. I've burnt a match, as is often referenced. And that needs to be like appropriately quantified, more so than the fact that I was at 310 and then 270. Like 270, who really cares? So we apply like a greater weighting or multiplier to the higher number, and we take this rolling average that continuously calculates, because if I'm at 400 for like a minute, then that becomes like more and more demanding and more bad will than being at, descending at like 30 to 0 watts for an amount of time, which is just great. It doesn't really matter. And that's how normalized power then, if you do these big peaks and troughs, you'll look at your average number and it's 300, but then you look at your normalized and it says 317. You're like, well, that's cool. I did more. But actually, it's like saying that you did the equivalent work of working at, off the top of my head, what's that, 5% above your threshold. And there's a reason why you finished barely able to hold 280 watts, right? So that's the way in which normalized power works. And I think that's important to go over because a lot of people just use it because it's higher. It's like a nicer number to look at because it's higher. And it is going to be just as like, so it is what a lot of these other metrics in terms of like your training load and your fatigue score and things are going to be based off of. So if you have huge variability and you have this big normalized power, that's not always a good thing if it's like not the goal of that session.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think if we kind of wrap it up here, because I know you have to get out for a run, normalized power also isn't the end all be all. And, that's something that we have to save for our advanced course because this is a super advanced topic to get into, why normalized power isn't king. So yeah, we'll have to save that, but normalized power is pretty good. But yeah, so there's a lot to look at with your power meter. I think that gives people a real good taster with this 3-part series.
Yeah, right, Matt. Well, that wraps us up for the 3-part series of episode 74, cycling with the power meter or training with power or getting your power, whatever we decide.
I guess, the name's still in the works.
Well, there's 3 parts, so it makes it a bit hard. But make sure you check out all of the links in the show notes, the power courses. We have not just for mountain biking and not just the Masterclass 6-part series, but we also have the running power and then the advanced power courses, which will be coming out, depends when you're listening to this, late 2021. So check those out. Get in contact with Matt and I if you're looking to get some coaching, get some training plans, whatever it is. Check out our sites. But yeah, until next time, guys, we'll catch you later.
See ya.